So I'm Ursula Erasmus, and for those of you who've not met me before, I'm a senior partner at Issoria. I lead the development area, which includes this wonderful community. The Issoria Community is a container for continued learning. It's here that we really want to elevate our change practice skills and expand our capability. Whether we're internal or external resources, and no matter our years of experience. One of the things that I love most about the community is we have very experienced practitioners working together with people who are quite new. So you might be an internal resource who's taken over change in an OD function, or you might be a newer consultant. And we just really love the fact that those levels of experience and the different types of experience come here to cross-pollinate. We're delighted, of course, that we can collaborate with peers across the world in this space. If you're new to Issoria, our end-to-end partner for change model includes two other Ds. One is delivery, which is our global network of outstanding consultants in change and change communication. And today you're going to meet Tom, who's a shining example of one of our consultants. Our third D is data, tools, and AI, where you'll find solutions to plan, manage, and track your change to ensure that you can deliver results. So if anyone's interested in the model after today, we're also always happy to talk to you about that, give you a bit of a demo, and talk about really how Issoria can work with you. But we're here today because we share an interest in adaptive change. Right before you all signed on, I mentioned to Tom that I'd had a quick Google search today again on adaptive change and suddenly realized that Harvard Business Review mentioned adaptive change for the first time in 2003. That's more than 20 years ago. And all of us know what has happened to change in the ensuing years. It has become way more speedy, rapid. The speed and the velocity of change has increased massively. And many things we couldn't even imagine 20 years ago, sort of in the technology space, is influencing how change looks in our organizations. This type of change is often described in literature as small and incremental, stuff that's just going on in our organizations all the time, as we evolve to meet the demands of our customers and our operating environments. And Tom's going to talk a lot more about that. But what I find most interesting of all is over the last 10 years, adaptive change keeps being flagged as an equal or bigger challenge in our businesses. Often this shows up in our annual employee surveys and focus groups, etc., where employees on many levels are calling out adaptive change as a source of both change fatigue and also the reason why we see an erosion of trust in our companies. So I'm really happy to be here today with Tom Silver. As I said, Tom is a consultant with Issoria, and Tom and I have enjoyed our conversations around adaptive change as we have prepared to be here with you today. Without further ado, Tom, I'm going to hand it over to you, and let's have a great conversation about adaptive change. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Ursula. That was a great introduction. So yeah, my name's Tom Silver, working as a consultant. I've worked in change for over 10 years. I'm also a life coach and a high performance coach, but my main client at the moment is a large oil and gas company. I'm really excited and glad to be here to talk about adaptive change. I think the first thing that comes to mind, just picking off some of the things that Ursula said there, is what's driving a lot of this adaptive change. And for me, it's all around improvement and that performance idea, those small incremental changes. You're adapting to situations and challenges that are happening, and our clients, what they're trying to do is make improvements that improve performance all the time. And I think that's really interesting, the point you made around it was first mentioned by the Harvard Business Review over 20 years ago. So I guess a question back to you then, Ursula, on that is, do you think that adaptive change has always been there? And if so, why is it such a hot topic now rather than 20 years ago?
I was thinking about that this morning. I was trying to preempt where the conversation might go. And I think it has always been there. I mean, if you just think about us in our day-to-day lives, right? You have a smartphone, you replace it, the new smartphone has a few new functions and what have you, or the thing that always gets me is the stuff they've taken away and it's like, why isn't it there anymore? I mean, one of my biggest bugbears over the last probably 10 years is what happened to PowerPoint. And I now know that's a moot point because we've got Canva, but there was a period where I thought, does Microsoft not understand at all why PowerPoint works? And so I had to constantly get my head around the tools, for example, that I was using. And I think adaptive change has always been there. I think it is really just part of progress. But one of the things I feel, before I came back into a consulting role, I was the director of organizational change at Roche. This was pharma company in the drug development area. And I had sort of a tinge of guilt about how we used to onboard new employees, which is we don't really, I think, talk about the fact that actually business is change. So when I was hiring people into my function, which was all about supporting change, we would talk about the big transformational initiatives, what methodologies we were using, how the portfolio committee made decisions, where the budgets came from and so on. But we didn't really talk about business is change. Every day is change. If we want to remain competitive, if we want to really grow or be in the right place in the market, we have to think about adapting all the time. And I feel like maybe we've glossed over that. And I believe one should never assume that people remember these things. It's often to me, you say something and then people say, well, that's obvious. But if you don't surface it explicitly, the obvious can disappear into the shadow. So I don't know if that really helps, Tom, but I do feel that quite often people feel that they've been blindsided by adaptive change because we don't talk about the fact that it is reality.
Yeah, I wonder also two things that sort of resonate with what you're saying. One about the fact that maybe we are all just a little bit more aware about changes that happen in organizations and also in our lives and in the products that we consume every day, and we have more literacy, we have more language around that as a topic, and we, especially as change practitioners, but I'm talking more around the users that normally we impact and the leaders that are having to make those difficult decisions around change all the time. So like you said, it's always been there, but actually now we have a better language around it through which we can talk about it and we highlight it more. And then also thinking about what you said regarding velocity. So just the world seems to be speeding up, and some of the things certainly that's happening in the US this week, and the sentiment around that, and just that idea post pandemic that a lot of people are suffering from burnout or are thinking about how they want to design their lives, and then that also extends to what they want work to look like. And I wonder whether that kind of burnout and that fatigue is being coupled with what am I experiencing also at work, and all of this fast treadmill that I'm on. I kind of want to just step off of it and try and take stock of what's happening. I think isn't helped by adaptive change and that increasing velocity.
Mm. Tom, I think we should ask in the chat, because I know a few of the people who are on the call so far, and I would love to know if any of you can say, when you create a picture, sort of a universal picture of the change that's happening in your organization. So, quite often some of you might have sort of a roadmap of the big transformations, etc. Do any of you actually include any either verbiage or illustrations in any way about all the other change that's happening sort of in between? So I'd love to know, just pop it in the chat. And, there's no right answer to this, but this is how we learn from each other. Because if someone is doing something sort of in an illustrative way, I think that would be a really great thing to know. So please use the chat and pop in there if you've got anything to share about how you are doing it in your organization.
Whilst we wait for that, I just wanted to share a couple of experiences that I've had personally with adaptive change. So a few years ago, I was working at a startup that was scaling, leading their change team. And I think, yes, we had our bigger projects going on. Yes, we were investing in transformation. It was mainly driving customer outcomes in the customer contact center and the customer experience teams. But a lot of what we were doing was adaptive change. We were looking forensically at how our customers were behaving, the results that they were getting, the number of contacts that they were making, the reasons why they were contacting us, what did they need help with, and we were constantly trying to make tweaks to improve those metrics, and all of that was coming up with some brilliant ideas, testing them out, abandoning them if they weren't working, and then doubling down on the ones that were, and really trying to make those smaller changes that would move the dial rather than something massive that would have a bigger impact, because those massive things that we were thinking about were going to take longer, or they might move the dial too far too quickly. But that did create a very difficult environment for the teams that were working with our customers, because they were having to keep up all the time with everything that was changing, and their knowledge around new initiatives or new messaging or new information that they needed to provide to customers needed to be very high and very, very relevant, and that was often a challenge. How could we cut through with all of this change to our recipients, our audience, such that it landed just as quickly as we were coming up with the ideas.
Right. So we have a few answers, Tom, in the chat, and Emma says yes. So I think I would love to hear a little bit more about what Emma has been doing. And there's a few other answers in the chat. This is great. So Emma, I'm going to invite you to come off chat and talk a little bit more about what you actually do, because I'm intrigued, and I'm sure everybody else is too.
Hello, everyone. So I've worked in various companies, starting for a very long time in PepsiCo, and then moving on to different kind of scales of program, kind of both at global and local level, and more recently in a very specific technology project in the UK. And I just think it's hugely important to try and understand, even if you can't do too much about it, if there are any kind of big, or I call them big or small changes, so big programs of change, or just smaller changes that are happening in the wider environment, and try and at least understand it. Ideally, try and sort of work together to integrate that kind of passive change, so that you can at least spot any change fatigue or big changes that are coming. And I find it so important, because I think you can then identify groups of impacted people, or just groups of stakeholders that actually just need to know about this, and you can coach leaders better to talk about this more holistically. It feels more joined up if you have those conversations. I'm not going to pretend it's always been hugely successful, but I just think it helps to kind of even be able to acknowledge and recognize where, if you're speaking to somebody, leader, somebody on the ground, doesn't matter, that you understand what's going on in their world, and then you can help to understand how they feel about it. And then Tom, you just alluded to it very briefly, but kind of that external change as well. So it's all good and well trying to change something within your company, industry, function, whatever it is, but if there's a big external factor that's happening as well, that can have a massive impact on trying to go live with the project, trying to change an organization, change a culture. So that's why I do always try and understand and integrate and speak to as many people as I can, because I think it just helps to start the conversation as a minimum.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Emma. Tom, I don't know if you want to ask anyone else. I'm really intrigued also by what Niona has popped in the chat.
Yeah. I think that, yeah, Niona, would you like to come off mute?
No. So I don't know if anyone's read the book The Art of Engagement. It's a book by Jim Horton, but I would highly recommend that if you haven't read it. But there are visuals in that book, and obviously now, Jim Horton has a company which is called Root, and it's part of Accenture now. But there are these visuals that Jim Horton has used to engage with stakeholders and employees and all of that, right? So we've in the past used similar, I would say, illustrations, which the primary focus of the drawing really is the context of the organizational change and what the stakeholders or that particular leadership team is likely experiencing, right? But along with that, the visual also takes into account some of those additional stakeholders, like here's what the customer is probably going to experience as a result of this change. And it's not maybe your number one concern, but it's something to think about. And here's what the marketplace might be experiencing. And then there's like a whirlwind which shows, okay, there's geopolitics and there are all of these other things that we need to be thinking about. And so as we go through that change journey and we start to have those discussions, whether it's, one of those, whether it's a team effectiveness session or something like that, right? And we weave this into that kind of a discussion, we start to uncover what else is impacting this team that the team hasn't even thought about, or and has considered as a part of their or their strategy going forward after a reorg or something like that. So I find that has been extremely helpful in uncovering what we don't typically look at. Yeah.
I love that, Niona. And I think, Tom and I have talked about the importance of having, telling the story of change, which is not the same as telling the story of a large transformation, but actually telling the story of change, which is really sort of chapter and verse what our organizations are trying to achieve. And what I'm hearing from what you've described from the book that you mentioned, The Art of Engagement, is visualizing it in a quite specific way. So I'm definitely going to jump in with that. That's a really lovely tip. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I love that. I love that as well. And I'm thinking about my current client and what we're trying to do is we've launched a new system that helps the teams kind of visualize what they're working on and the sites that they're working on remotely, etc. And we've deployed that, and now we are in the phase of giving them more features and enhancements. But it's really difficult. The leaders that we're working at all the different sites are experiencing so much change. There's reorganization going on. There's new initiatives all the time. There's new technologies to invest in. There's stuff that overlaps with what our system does, with what our technology does. It's very difficult for them to kind of grab onto the stuff that we're trying to provide to them and really run with it. And I know that part of the challenge is just the sheer amount of change. And I feel if I use what you're describing, both of you, or what you're describing, that could help them make sense of it. And I think that is our role. I guess that's useful for us as well when we are change managers tied to a project versus tied to a function as a whole, because it's useful for us to also understand what is going on more widely for this leader or for the audience, and really trying to align, okay, well, if you implement this new feature that we're talking about, it can help you over in this other area, this other aim that your organization or your team has, and it will help you achieve that. So really using those visuals to connect the dots, I think, could be very powerful.
That's wonderful. Yeah, absolutely, Tom. I'm going to do a slight change of direction because my brain is fizzing right now and thinking about this, and with this idea of sort of painting or providing a bigger picture and thinking almost about the radius of change. If you think about it, I love the term that is used in agile change about the change blast radius. And it's a visual that just absolutely sticks in my head, because you move something somewhere and there is always a ripple effect or a blast effect that goes often a lot further than we can imagine. But I wanted Tom to ask you about your thoughts about agile change as a method or an approach in organizations where adaptive change is so pervasive.
Yes, I was thinking about this too. I'm not sure I've prepared an answer, but just my initial reaction, and one of the questions that I was going to ask was, is agile driving adaptive change, or is adaptive change made possible by teams that are working in an agile manner, right? Because I think I have worked in organizations where agile is used to take hold of really good ideas, deliver something that looks like a proof of concept, try some stuff out, and then goes in multiple different directions, kind of like the blast radius that you're talking about. And often that can churn up a lot of change that maybe people didn't actually ask for or didn't really want, or is replicating something that already exists. And sometimes it's the motivation behind that kind of gets in the way. But kind of going back to your question, I think that agile can be used as a really positive force for that adaptive change. It's something that I used in my previous organization, whereby if you get the right, I think it's the principles of agile rather than just the steps that you walk.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. It's the getting the right people in the room who can team on this. So we would have the finance person, the customer, the voice of the customer, the country managers, the person that understood the process, getting those right people in the room made for some fantastic teams that then could deliver stuff quite quickly, and we could work out very quickly whether it was working or not. But I think something that is always a conversation that we come back to, whether we're doing it in an agile way or not, for adaptive change, it is about the value, right? I think more too often there are too many changes going on, and we're not thinking enough about what value will these actually drive. I think that I find that my clients really struggle with that. They just to kind of try and grasp what should they be showing in terms of value, because I think people have different expectations. Some people want to see the financials, and for other people it's just enough to say that it's working and it's delivered. And actually finding a really happy medium that has authenticity in showing its value is quite hard and can be quite subjective. What are your thoughts on kind of the value of all of those different adaptive changes?
I do think, and I've experienced this quite often, is, organizations are full of bright people who have great ideas. And in some organizations, culturally, people sort of are given a little bit of space to work with those great ideas. Amazing. But I think so sometimes I think they have great ideas when they haven't fully, say, crystallized in business parlance the business case for doing something, but as they work on it, it becomes apparent at how much value it could add. And I think my challenge has always been less about finding new ideas and working them up, but it's about when and what do you actually decide to stop if it shows that it's not really going to add value. And as human beings, we're very interesting. When we are attached to an idea, when we're attached to an idea, it is very hard to actually say, no, I don't think this is a winner, and put it down. But I think that's a muscle we need to learn to use more. And so for me, it's always been going back to sort of that overall story of change for the organization that has its roots in strategy and its wings in aspiration. And say, if we're doing this, is it going to help us really achieve and deliver on our strategy? Is it going to help us emerge into the marketplace where we aspire to be? So I always use those, which are, of course, really not scientific. And over the years, I've had some very interesting conversations with people in finance and portfolio management who've sort of rolled their eyes and looked at me. And I said, but that to me is the litmus test. Our organization is here for a reason. And unless that reason has substantially changed, let's look at all these incremental new ideas, innovations that don't require massive resources and huge budgets and tons of planning, but could really help us make a speedier, not necessarily a quick, but a speedier shift towards where we want to go. And how do we do that in a way that we engage people, that it doesn't feel like we're constantly shifting the ground that they're on? You made a point right at the beginning, Tom, that's very dear to my heart, is about performance. And I know that, most people go to work wanting to do their best, believing that they're doing their best. And when things feel like they're in flux all the time, I've had many conversations with people who've just told me, I just don't know if I'm performing. I have no way of knowing if what I'm doing is good enough, etc. And so I think there's a number of shadows from this adaptive change work that we really need to engage other functions in, or other disciplines, for example, HR, and talk about what does the performance conversation look like around these adaptive initiatives. If somebody is assigned a portion of their time onto an adaptive initiative, how do we recognize that, not necessarily just the result, but the trying, the development? And most adaptive change means that you're also in part sort of acting as a change agent within your function, because you're the one who's going to be talking about it and showing up for that. So I think there's an opportunity that we need to consider in this adaptive change environment to bring other players, disciplines, functions in. It's sort of and talk about it in a more whole system approach. The other thing that I think is quite challenging in adaptive change is this tension between, keeping the lights on and delivering today's targets and keeping our customers happy, and thinking about that whole, where do we want to emerge in the future so that we have a bigger market share, or we are more profitable, or we are making more impact in whatever ways we're measuring it, whether it's on sustainability, etc. So that is always, to me, a bit of an internal tension. And I personally like to include that in my conversations around adaptive change, because the big transformational initiatives will often have lines in their business case about these things. But the adaptive changes, I think, more conversation up front might make adaptive change more palatable and actually more impactful. But of course, I'm now sitting in a world where I'm not actually in an organization right now. And so, am I still as objective as I was when I was actually in an internal role?
So I think from a couple of the things you're saying, it made me think about that beauty in kind of working autonomously. In large organizations, you have a lot of kind of middle leaders and a lot of people that are given that autonomy to spin up ideas, to make adaptive changes, and that thought process that really those ideas coming from the bottom should align with the vision that exists from the top, but that doesn't always happen. And I think your point is really well made around what of all of those initiatives do we stop. So I think I've got two questions, one for you, Ursula, on that, and then one for the community in the chat. So the question to you is, how do we manage that challenge of all of those adaptive change initiatives with the leadership and the direction and the vision of an organization? How do we manage and govern that on an organizational level without stifling maybe some of that innovation that exists? And then the question to the community is, how as change managers do we influence that? So what is our opportunity to influence the managing of all of those different adaptive change initiatives such that they really do contribute to a North Star or a vision in an organization?
I'll try and answer the question based on my experience, Tom. So I worked really hard to try and take the label of change out of the adaptive conversation. So as an internal leader, I just talked about the way we need to work now. Let's look at the way we are working. What is it that we could do to improve the way we work now? So I really just tried to take the word change out, because I do know we're also human, and many of us have had really some traumatic experiences with change, not necessarily just at work, but change is something that is part of living, and it's not always a good thing. It doesn't always go the way we think. So I took the word change out as much as possible, because I really wanted to allow people just to say, oh, if this is what the strategy is, this is where we're going. What can we do to best achieve that? So I really tried to change my own language as a leader. And then, of course, some of those, let's call them little projects, as they popped up, I would also encourage people to really use their own sort of self-leadership to determine how do they want to do this. Do you want to get a bunch of colleagues together? Do you want to go off and do something on your own and then bring it back for a response? So I really wanted people to sort of own the way it unfolded, with a lot of conversation. Do you have the time, etc. And I think in that way, people sort of owning the outcome, but not being so fixed on it that if it didn't work out or someone else came with a better idea, we were really in it together. I saw that Niona had mentioned design thinking, and I actually did at one stage send my whole team on a design thinking course, not because I wanted them to be purists in design thinking, but again, it's like the principles of design thinking and the principles of Agile, I think, can really, really help us. But I also know, and I just saw what Joseph had put here in the chat, is it needs to be something that is accepted in the DNA of your organization. Because I have worked in organizations where there was a huge drive to make a difference, make an impact, achieve, constantly achieve better results. But if anyone tried to do anything really innovative that perhaps challenged the way a senior leader had set up their organization, it was immediately swatted down. And so how in that particular organization, how they handled that is you would see that idea maybe 6 months later popping up on a proposal at the portfolio committee. We need to have a big project for this. Two things happen there. One is you've lost all that time, but most importantly, you've lost the trust of the people who were trying to bring it to life in a more organic way, without being terribly structured about it. And so for me, I think the big things are, if you're in a highly regulated environment. So obviously for me, when I was working in a pharmaceutical company, some things didn't lend themselves to being sort of thought of completely to their conclusion in an adaptive way, but we still use that sort of adaptive, innovative process for the early thinking, to then possibly turn it into a project that needed to be really have good oversight, etc. And then other things that were less impacted by the requirements of the regulatory environment, we could just see where they went and allowed them to grow. But I think it's enormously important about how your senior leadership sees innovation and is willing to be open. In fact, most importantly, if your senior leaders are willing to accept that their dearest held ideas might not be the best ideas, then you're in an environment where adaptive change, I think, thrives and really makes a difference and adds value. But if you're in an organization where adaptive change always needs to be sort of slightly be under the water or behind a screen, that doesn't really work long term. You get a lot of people feeling very disillusioned, unsupported, etc. And I think it becomes an organization where there's too much instability because it feels like there's always whispers going on. So culture is massively important, I think, to how adaptive change can work and should work in our organizations. That was a very long answer.
No, but thank you for that. I think that's given us a lot to think about. And one of the things that I wrote down before the session was that you need a culture which sees adaptive change as opportunities and not threats. And I think what you're saying is about that culture, but it's also about that leadership, being able to say, I'm not always right, and there's some really good ideas coming through that we need to be thinking about and we need to be leveraging. We've got some feedback in the chat. So someone said that what's really challenging is when change is not representing an actual benefit. I think that happens all the time. That for whatever reason you find yourself supporting a change that needs to happen. Maybe it's a regulatory change or something that's driving it externally or internally, and it actually for the end users there isn't much of the what's in it for me. And we spoke about this when preparing for the session, that in a world where there are lots of change initiatives, lots of adaptive change perhaps taking place, how do you get that sponsorship for the right change initiatives so that they can kind of stand out and compete against other changes?
Before I go to that, Tom, I just want to respond to that question about, when, for example, more manual steps or more approvals are required. And I suddenly just felt this wave of sort of emotion in me because I've been through this before. And I think for me, the answer is really clear. If those types of changes, which mean more manual steps, more approvals, what might appear to be more constraints to the end user, if those are because it will protect your license to operate, and again, here I go back to highly regulated industries, that is actually what's in it for me, because that means you will still have a job because we will still have a business. And those are tough conversations. So I, over the years, I really had to develop my own backbone to have those conversations. And sometimes I had to coach people way senior to myself to say, you're going to have a negative backlash unless you tell people that the real reason we need to do this is if we need a license to operate. Otherwise, everybody's job is at risk. And so, that to me would be probably the only reason in that, for compliance, for license to operate, absolutely. If people are suggesting to put in more approvals and things like that, just because they want to have more control over the way people are working, I don't want to work in a country. I do not want to work in a company like that. So I think, there's a cultural aspect there that if there isn't the right reason for adding constraints and controls, then you have to ask the question, do I really want to be here? But your question about sponsorship is an interesting one.
Sorry, I was just going to say on that, I used to work with someone who had a great response to that question, and it's that we have flexibility as change managers. You might not have that flexibility with what the change is, but you have flexibility in how you can guide the end users through that change. And so, yes, there are going to be more manual steps and approvals because there are, for whatever the reason is, and this is the justified reason. But as we go through that, let's involve you in designing what that might look like, and where's the sand that you can shift and
Right.
and have an influence over that change, so it doesn't feel like it's completely being done to you, but you have a voice as an end user in that. So I thought I would add that on.
That's great, Tom. And I do think that it's really important to think about how the change practitioner can really work in these, what I would call sort of thornier environments, to really make change work. And, one of the things as a change practitioner is to be able to know how also to work with and coach the leaders so that the leaders are taking the right steps and are using the right language and supporting in the right way. So sometimes you have to say, this is mandated and I will support you in this way. So it's always that balance. I think that's a point really well made. And I just wanted to say something then to your second part of your question. It was about sponsorship and how do you get changes to stand out. I might be completely different to everyone else who's on this call, but I in some ways feel that sponsorship is a bit dead, because a sponsor is often so far removed from the day-to-day of the people who are actually doing the work. I think, I over the last probably 10 years, my focus has been much more on managers, the frontline people leaders, and the directors in organizations, because I think these are the cohorts of people in organizations that the employees really look towards for support and guidance. So my personal view on sponsorship in sort of the traditional way has really changed. I don't think you necessarily need to go without a sponsor altogether, but I think the accountability for making change work has really shifted, and it needs to be in the middle and the lower parts of the organization, because that's where the conversations happen around, should we be taking a thread from this huge transformational change and seeing if we can do some adaptive work to make it work better, for example, because not all adaptive change, it just is grassroots. Some of it actually grows out of these large transformational projects. So I've got a slightly different idea, because as I said, I think change is just part of business. And if we think about it as not something that's added to the plate, but it is actually the plate, then I think the way we work with change, and particularly the adaptive change, shifts a little bit. And we're in it together. How do we best work to get the results that we want? So that's been my personal philosophy, and I've made some small wins in organizations doing that, but it's really where I feel we can change the game around adaptive change and help people not be so exhausted and feel everything is fragmented.
Yeah, I think you got some support on that in the chat, which is good. I think on the current experience that I'm living at work with my clients is that the I won't necessarily make it a point about sponsorship, but I will make it a point about kind of different influential people, and they might not necessarily hold a title or a leadership position, but thinking about their agendas, and oftentimes their agendas can become blockers, or they can then help your adaptive change. So I think it's very important to do a bit of an exercise as a change manager to think about who are the people that are for or against what's going on and why, and how can you build strong relationships with those people, not necessarily to tell them that they're wrong or try and convince them otherwise, but to really actually understand from their point of view, why they oppose a certain change or what the blocker is. And I think we don't do enough to learn from each other and really listen. Often we think, right, got this change, we've got to be successful in it, this is how I'm going to design it, this is what I'm going to put into this is the effort that I'm going to put in. And it takes a lot to just stop sometimes and go, actually, I'm going to put the feelers out and listen and try and understand from some other people's perspective. And I think that's particularly important with adaptive change.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Nyona, thank you very much for your added comment in the chat. It's really lovely. And I think, you're talking about child protective services, for sure, when there is a compelling reason to do these things, it might not be specifically regulatory or compliance driven, but safeguarding children, for example, or youth at risk or women or whatever it is, that is a real reason why sometimes we have to do this extra work. So, I think it's looking at the gravity of not doing something versus doing it and actually seeing a really positive outcome. So thank you. That's a really, really great comment. There's something else, Tom, I just wanted to unpack with you, and we've got maybe 2 minutes left before we ask something back of everybody on here. But one of the things we talked about was, as a change manager, as a change practitioner in an organization, whether you're an external consultant or an internal resource, the splitting of time between the big projects and the adaptive change. What are your thoughts on that, or your experience, Tom?
Yeah, I think initially what comes to mind is how projects are funded. So often you are a change manager there assigned to certain projects. I think then it can be very difficult to see something else going on in the organization that needs help, but actually do you have license to go and support that? You might be in a role that's a little bit more assigned to a function where you can do that. But I think what we spoke about before, and what I truly believe, is really trying to understand the return on investment. And I think that's perhaps something that we could even have another hour talking about. And I'm not sure we've got enough time to cover it. But I think that is a good mindset to go into this, thinking about where am I going to split my time, and what's the return on investment.
Okay, that's great. And I think you're right, Tom, because also the environment sometimes is, if you're here, I would trust you to put your effort where it's going to deliver the best results, where it's going to help but not all environments are like that. So I think it could definitely warrant another conversation. Well, we have covered a lot of ground, and I would like to now turn back to the audience and ask you to use the chat and just tell us if you still have a big, thorny, outstanding question, or what is, from this conversation, what has impacted you most? What has been a great reminder or a new aha? I'd really like to hear about that before we sort of get to the end of the session. So take a moment and either put your big question in there or what's really impacted you from the discussion so far. And as people are doing that, Tom, one of the things you and I talked about over the past few months was resilience. And I keep feeling like it's another conversation we also should talk about, because so many people tell me when I talk to people in organizations who are, even people who are at a director level, they just tell me, I feel like I'm completely in the dark. I know what's happening in my little space, and I'm feeling some anxiety, is the word that is often used, about everything else that's going on around me that I am not aware of. So I think, we might need to talk about resilience too.
I'm really interested in the intersection between your life outside of work and your life inside of work, and how sometimes your personality needs to shift, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you bring your authentic self to work. But I think that some of that is a wider conversation on our society today and what we're all experiencing. And like I was saying before, the post-pandemic burnout that people are feeling. And actually, I think some of that is kind of right. I want to be able to control everything that's going on, and I don't know how to feel comfortable knowing that I'm never going to be able to control that. I think that's something that I certainly suffer with at work, where I've got my little bit, but I don't know what's happening over there, and I'm trying to anticipate how it might impact on my project, and just to give myself the freedom just to go, actually, I can't control that, and I need to stop putting my thoughts and efforts in something that may or may not happen, and I just need to plan for the best. Takes a moment.
Great. I'm looking at what's coming in the chat, and it's really interesting. Deep dive in org culture, conditions and characteristics to boost adaptive change. Sylvia, yes, we can definitely think about including that in the community as a future. I like Niona's comment about, having the two run in parallel and making sure you've got some analytics as well, thinking about the opportunities for crossover. Performance management cycle with change progress. Yep, love that that's impacted someone. Thanks, Emma, for your comments on the sponsor and its effectiveness. Oh, there's lots of threads here we can pick up. Let's see, Laura is not overly familiar with this concept. Great, Laura. I'm so glad everything has sort of been opened your eyes to things. Love that. And you can keep commenting in the chat if you want to. One of the things I'm just going to share before I hand over to Tom to wrap up is I've been spending some time for the last few years actually following latest neuroscience research. And one of the things that is a very interesting thread, so I'm not saying it as a conclusion, but I really do plan to talk about it in the community. I do plan to do a session next year, is how we now understand that the brain and what we used to call the lizard brain and the fight or flight response actually is not how the brain works. And I don't have an answer yet, but I'm really trying to figure out our new understanding of the brain. What does that really mean for change? Because I think quite often, and in the sort of, let me call it the more traditional methodologies for change, the tips and the guidance that we've given both for change practitioners and for people leaders might actually not be as on point as they could be now that we understand the brain works a little differently. So what am I doing about that now? Why am I telling you about this now? I really just want people to say, let's have a conversation about what is going on for you. So if someone is feeling stressed or pushing back or whatever, invite the conversation first, because you may learn something or discover that you've made an assumption that is not true, and you may be able to support your people, whether it's your peers, your direct reports, or your consultants, in a totally different way. So that's just a thought that I'm going to pull on for 2025. Tom, without further ado, I'm going to give you the last minute and a half for a wrap up.
Thank you. No, I think that's another really interesting conversation that we could have, and some good advice there in how we deal with our stakeholders. I think the things that have resonated for me is the point around culture, and how what culture you have in the organization can dictate how adaptive change is seen and how it's embraced or how it's managed. So I think it's really important to think about what we can do to try and influence those cultures or work positively within a culture. And then I just loved what you were saying about the change blast radius, and just really thinking that through. And I think, just to echo your points of what you've just said, we think about change in terms of a very methodological way, or the process that we need to go through. And sometimes it helps to step outside of that and think about some nuances around that, like change blast radius, or how are people just feeling that day and experiencing what you're trying to describe to them, and having just a conversation with them about what would make this easier for you. So yeah.
Wonderful. Well, at this point, we're at time, and I want to thank you, Tom, so very much for being here. Not everybody on the call has had the benefit of our conversations about adaptive change leading up to today, but they were wonderful, and I thank you for all the time you've invested. And to everybody who showed up here today, thank you very much. This is exactly why we have the community. Come into this container, share ideas. You don't have to agree, and that's okay, because not every situation is the same. So I love the variety of comments, etc. And it's always a pleasure to be here. If anyone has any thoughts, comments, or ideas, or you would like to bring something to the community after this, shoot me an email. I'm always open for new ideas. Thank you, and wherever you are, may the rest of your day be great. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.